grandson and grandfather. Chapter 1, in which the tree with the zinc plaster appears again. Some time after the events which we have just recorded, Sieur Boulatruelle experienced a lively emotion. Sieur Boulatruelle was that road mender of Montfermeil whom the reader has already seen in the gloomy parts of this book. Boulatruelle, as the reader may, perchance, recall, was a man who was occupied with divers and troublesome matters. He broke stones and damaged travelers on the highway. Road mender and thief as he was, he cherished one dream. He believed in the treasures buried in the forest of Montfermeil. He hoped someday to find the money in the earth at the foot of a tree. In the meanwhile, he lived to search the pockets of passers-by. Nevertheless, for an instant, he was prudent. He had just escaped neatly. He had been, as the reader is aware, picked up in Jondrette's garret in company with the other ruffians. Utility of a vice. His drunkenness had been his salvation. The authorities had never been able to make out whether he had been there in the quality of a robber or a man who had been robbed. An order of noli prosequi, founded on his well-authenticated state of intoxication on the evening of the ambush, had set him at liberty. He had taken to his heels. He had returned to his road from Gagny to Lagny. To make, under administrative supervision, broken stone for the good of the state, with downcast mien, in a very pensive mood, his ardor for theft somewhat cooled. But he was addicted none the less tenderly to the wine which had recently saved him. As for the lively emotion which he had experienced a short time after his return to his road mender's turf-thatched cot, here it is. One morning, Boulatruelle, while on his way as was his wont, to his work, and possibly also to his ambush, a little before daybreak caught sight, through the branches of the trees, of a man, whose back alone he saw, but the shape of whose shoulders, as it seemed to him at that distance and in the early dusk, was not entirely unfamiliar to him. Boulatruelle, although intoxicated, had a correct and lucid memory, a defensive arm that is indispensable to anyone who is at all in conflict with legal order. "Where the deuce have I seen something like that man yonder?" he said to himself. But he could make himself no answer, except that the man resembled someone of whom his memory preserved a confused trace. However, apart from the identity which he could not manage to catch, Boulatruelle put things together and made calculations. This man did not belong in the countryside. He had just arrived there. On foot, evidently. No public conveyance passes through Montfermeil at that hour. He had walked all night. Whence came he? Not from a very great distance. For he had neither haversack, nor bundle. From Paris, no doubt. Why was he in these woods? Why was he there at such an hour? What had he come there for? Boulatruelle thought of the treasure. By dint of ransacking his memory, he recalled in a vague way that he had already, many years before, had a similar alarm in connection with a man who produced on him the effect that he might well be this very individual. "By the deuce," said Boulatruelle, "I'll find him again. I'll discover the parish of that parishioner. This prowler of Patron Manette has a reason, and I'll know it. People can't have secrets in my forest if I don't have a finger in the pie." He took his pickaxe, which was very sharply pointed. "There now," he grumbled, "is something that will search the earth and a man." And, as one knots one thread to another thread, he took up the line of march at his best pace in the direction which the man must follow, and set out across the thickets. When he had compassed 100 strides, the day, which was already beginning to break, came to his assistance. Footprints stamped in the sand. Weeds trodden down here and there. Heather crushed. Young branches in the brushwood bent and in the act of straightening themselves up again with the graceful deliberation of the arms of a pretty woman who stretches herself when she wakes. Pointed out to him a sort of track. He followed it, then lost it. Time was flying. He plunged deeper into the woods and came to a sort of eminence. An early huntsman who was passing in the distance along a path, whistling the air of Guillory, suggested to him the idea of climbing a tree. Old as he was agile. There stood close at hand a beech tree of great size, worthy of Tityrus and of Boulatruelle. Boulatruelle ascended the beech as high as he was able. The idea was a good one. On scrutinizing the solitary waste on the side where the forest is thoroughly entangled and wild, Boulatruelle suddenly caught sight of his man. Hardly had he got his eye upon him when he lost sight of him. The man entered, or rather, glided into, an open glade, at a considerable distance, masked by large trees, but with which Boulatruelle was perfectly familiar, on account of having noticed, near a large pile of porous stones, an ailing chestnut tree bandaged with a sheet of zinc nailed directly upon the bark. This glade was the one which was formerly called the Blaru bottom. The heap of stones, destined for no one knows what employment, which was visible there 30 years ago, is doubtless still there. Nothing equals a heap of stones in longevity, unless it is a board fence. They are temporary expedients. What a reason for lasting. Boulatruelle, with the rapidity of joy, dropped rather than descended from the tree. The lair was unearthed, the question now was to seize the beast. That famous treasure of his dreams was probably there. It was no small matter to reach that glade. By the beaten paths, which indulge in 1,000 teasing zigzags, it required a good quarter of an hour. In a bee-line, through the underbrush, which is peculiarly dense, very thorny, and very aggressive in that locality, a full half-hour was necessary. Boulatruelle committed the error of not comprehending this. He believed in the straight line. A respectable optical illusion which ruins many a man. The thicket, bristling as it was, struck him as the best road. "Let's take to the wolves' Rue de Rivoli," said he. Boulatruelle, accustomed to taking crooked courses, was on this occasion guilty of the fault of going straight. He flung himself resolutely into the tangle of undergrowth. He had to deal with holly bushes, nettles, hawthorns, eglantines, thistles, and very irascible brambles. He was much lacerated. At the bottom of the ravine he found water which he was obliged to traverse. At last he reached the Blaru bottom, after the lapse of 40 minutes, sweating, soaked, breathless, scratched, and ferocious. There was no one in the glade. Boulatruelle rushed to the heap of stones. It was in its place. It had not been carried off. As for the man, he had vanished in the forest. He had made his escape. Where? In what direction? Into what thicket? Impossible to guess. And, heartrending to say, there, behind the pile of stones, in front of the tree with the sheet of zinc, was freshly turned earth, a pickaxe, abandoned or forgotten, and a hole. The hole was empty. "Thief!" shrieked Boulatruelle, shaking his fist at the horizon. Chapter 2. Marius, emerging from civil war, makes ready for domestic war. For a long time, Marius was neither dead nor alive. For many weeks he lay in a fever accompanied by delirium, and by tolerably grave cerebral symptoms, caused more by the shocks of the wounds on the head than by the wounds themselves. He repeated Cosette's name for whole nights in the melancholy loquacity of fever, and with the sombre obstinacy of agony. The extent of some of the lesions presented a serious danger. The suppuration of large wounds being always liable to become reabsorbed, and consequently, to kill the sick man, under certain atmospheric conditions. At every change of weather, at the slightest storm, the physician was uneasy. Above all things, he repeated, let the wounded man be subjected to no emotion. The dressing of the wounds was complicated and difficult, the fixation of apparatus and bandages by cerecloths not having been invented as yet, at that epoch. Nicolette used up a sheet as big as the ceiling, as she put it, for lint. It was not without difficulty that the chloruretted lotions and the nitrate of silver overcame the gangrene. As long as there was any danger, M. Gillenormand, seated in despair at his grandson's pillow, was, like Marius, neither alive nor dead. Every day, sometimes twice a day, a very well-dressed gentleman with white hair, such was the description given by the porter, came to inquire about the wounded man, and left a large package of lint for the dressings. Finally, on the 7th of September, 4 months to a day, after the sorrowful night when he had been brought back to his grandfather in a dying condition, the doctor declared that he would answer for Marius. Convalescence began. But Marius was forced to remain for 2 months more stretched out on a long chair, on account of the results called up by the fracture of his collarbone. There always is a last wound like that which will not close, and which prolongs the dressings indefinitely, to the great annoyance of the sick person. However, this long illness and this long convalescence saved him from all pursuit. In France, there is no wrath, not even of a public character, which 6 months will not extinguish. Revolts, in the present state of society, are so much the fault of everyone, that they are followed by a certain necessity of shutting the eyes. Let us add, that the inexcusable Gisquet order, which enjoined doctors to lodge information against the wounded, having outraged public opinion, and not opinion alone, but the king first of all, the wounded were covered and protected by this indignation. And, with the exception of those who had been made prisoners in the very act of combat, the councils of war did not dare to trouble anyone. So Marius was left in peace. M. Gillenormand first passed through all manner of anguish, and then through every form of ecstasy. It was found difficult to prevent his passing every night beside the wounded man. He had his big armchair carried to Marius' bedside. He required his daughter to take the finest linen in the house for compresses and bandages. Mademoiselle Gillenormand, like a sage and elderly person, contrived to spare the fine linen, while allowing the grandfather to think that he was obeyed. M. Gillenormand would not permit anyone to explain to him, that for the preparation of lint batiste is not nearly so good as coarse linen, nor new linen as old linen. He was present at all the dressings of the wounds from which Mademoiselle Gillenormand modestly absented herself. When the dead flesh was cut away with scissors, he said, Nothing was more touching than to see him with his gentle, senile palsy, offer the wounded man a cup of his cooling draught. He overwhelmed the doctor with questions. He did not observe that he asked the same ones over and over again. On the day when the doctor announced to him that Marius was out of danger, the good man was in a delirium. He made his porter a present of 3 louis. That evening, on his return to his own chamber, he danced a gavotte, using his thumb and forefinger as castanets, and he sang the following song. Jean est née et fougère. Vrai nid d'un berger. J'adore son jupon. Frippen. Amour. Tu vis nl. Car c'est dans ses prunelles. Que tu mets ton carquois. Narquois. Moi, je le chante, et j'aime. Plus que Diane mime. Jean et ses deux titans. Bretons. Opening square bracket. Jean was born at Fougères, a true shepherd's nest. I adore her petticoat, the rogue. Love, thou dwellest in her. For, 'tis in her eyes that thou plackest thy quiver, sly scamp. As for me, I sing her, and I love, more than Diana herself, Jean and her firm Breton breasts. Closing square bracket. Point 61. Then he knelt upon a chair, and Basque, who was watching him through the half-open door, made sure that he was praying. Up to that time, he had not believed in God. At each succeeding phase of improvement, which became more and more pronounced, the grandfather raved. He executed a multitude of mechanical actions full of joy. He ascended and descended the stairs, without knowing why. A pretty female neighbor was amazed one morning at receiving a big bouquet. It was M. Gillenormand who had sent it to her. The husband made a jealous scene. M. Gillenormand tried to draw Nicolette upon his knees. He called Marius, M. Le Baron. He shouted, "Long live the Republic!" Every moment, he kept asking the doctor, "Is he no longer in danger?" He gazed upon Marius with the eyes of a grandmother. He brooded over him while he ate. He no longer knew himself, he no longer rendered himself an account of himself. Marius was the master of the house, there was abdication in his joy, he was the grandson of his grandson. In the state of joy in which he then was, he was the most venerable of children. In his fear lest he might fatigue or annoy the convalescent, he stepped behind him to smile. He was content, joyous, delighted, charming, young. His white locks added a gentle majesty to the gay radiance of his visage. When grace is mingled with wrinkles, it is adorable. There is an indescribable aurora in beaming old age. As for Marius, as he allowed him to dress his wounds and care for him, he had but one fixed idea. Cosette. After the fever and delirium had left him, he did not again pronounce her name, and it might have been supposed that he no longer thought of her. He held his peace, precisely because his soul was there. He did not know what had become of Cosette. The whole affair of the Rue de la Chanvrerie was like a cloud in his memory. Shadows that were almost indistinct floated through his mind: Eponine, Gavroche, Mabeuf, the Thénardiers, all his friends gloomily intermingled with the smoke of the barricade. The strange passage of M. Fauchelevent through that adventure produced on him the effect of a puzzle in a tempest. He understood nothing connected with his own life, he did not know how nor by whom he had been saved, and no one of those around him knew this. All that they had been able to tell him was, that he had been brought home at night in a hackney coach, to the Rue des Filles du Calvaire. Past, present, future were nothing more to him than the mist of a vague idea. But in that fog there was one immovable point, one clear and precise outline, something made of granite, a resolution, a will. To find Cosette once more. For him, the idea of life was not distinct from the idea of Cosette. He had decreed in his heart that he would not accept the one without the other. And he was immovably resolved to exact of any person whatever, who should desire to force him to life, from his grandfather, from fate, from hell, the restitution of his vanished Eden. He did not conceal from himself the fact that obstacles existed. Let us here emphasize one detail: he was not won over and was but little softened by all the solicitude and tenderness of his grandfather. In the first place, he was not in the secret. Then, in his reveries of an invalid, which was still feverish, possibly, he distrusted this tenderness as a strange and novel thing, which had for its object his conquest. He remained cold. The grandfather absolutely wasted his poor old smile. Marius said to himself that it was all right so long as he, Marius, did not speak, and let things take their course. But that when it became a question of Cosette, he would find another face, and that his grandfather's true attitude would be unmasked. Then there would be an unpleasant scene. A recrudescence of family questions. A confrontation of positions, every sort of sarcasm and all manner of objections at one and the same time: fauchelevent, coupelevent, fortune, poverty, a stone about his neck, the future. Violent resistance. Conclusion. A refusal. Marius stiffened himself in advance. And then, in proportion as he regained life, the old ulcers of his memory opened once more, he reflected again on the past. Colonel Pontmercy placed himself once more between M. Gillenormand and him, Marius. He told himself that he had no true kindness to expect from a person who had been so unjust and so hard to his father. And with health, there returned to him a sort of harshness towards his grandfather. The old man was gently pained by this. M. Gillenormand, without however allowing it to appear, observed that Marius, ever since the latter had been brought back to him and had regained consciousness, had not once called him father. It is true that he did not say monsieur to him. But he contrived not to say either the one or the other, by means of a certain way of turning his phrases. Obviously, a crisis was approaching. As almost always happens in such cases, Marius skirmished before giving battle, by way of proving himself. This is called feeling the ground. One morning it came to pass that M. Gillenormand spoke slightingly of the convention, apropos of a newspaper which had fallen into his hands, and gave vent to a royalist harangue on Danton, Saint-Just and Robespierre. The men of '93 were giants, said Marius with severity. The old man held his peace, and uttered not a sound during the remainder of that day. Marius, who had always present to his mind the inflexible grandfather of his early years, interpreted this silence as a profound concentration of wrath, augured from it a hot conflict, and augmented his preparations for the fray in the inmost recesses of his mind. He decided that, in case of a refusal, he would tear off his bandages, dislocate his collarbone, that he would lay bare all the wounds which he had left, and would reject all food. His wounds were his munitions of war. He would have cosette or die. He awaited the propitious moment with the crafty patience of the sick. That moment arrived.